Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. We are extremely excited and lucky to have Professor Curt Smith here today to speak with us. Professor Smith has worn many hats over the years. He was a presidential speechwriter for President George H.W. Bush. He's an author of countless books. He's a media host, a columnist, and a senior lecturer here at the U of R. Professor Smith wrote more speeches than anyone for President George H.W. Bush. His work has been acknowledged by news sources all over the country. The New York Times says his work is the high point of Bush familial eloquence. Professor Smith's 17th and most recent book is titled The Presidents and the Pastime: The History of Baseball and the White House. He was labeled the ideal author to be the first to exhaustively explore the tie between the two great American institutions of the presidency and baseball. USA Today labeled Professor Smith the leading voice of authority on baseball broadcasting, while others have claimed him to be simply one of the best baseball historians ever. Professor Smith has been a Gatehouse Media columnist, a National Public Radio affiliate series host, a former Gannett reporter, Saturday Evening Post senior editor, while he has also hosted XM, Satellite Radio, Smithsonian Institution, and the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum Series. He's also been named New York State Associated Press Best Radio Commentator. Additionally, his work can be found in many newspapers and magazines, including Newsweek, Reader's Digest, Sports Illustrated, and the New York Times. In 1998, Professor Smith joined the University of Rochester faculty and has been teaching public speaking and presidential rhetoric ever since. His last anecdote, and the one that I find the most impressive, is NBC sports broadcaster Bob Costas said Curt Smith stands up for the beauty of words. Professor, that is quite the resume. Thank you again for joining us. The mic is now yours.
Thank you. Bob would be pleased with that reference. Father Cool, members of the University of Rochester community, the Catholic community of Rochester, Newman, St. Sebastian Society, love all friends. Joe, when I'm introduced, I think of what former President Lyndon Johnson said when he heard an introduction that even he thought generous. Johnson would say that he wished his parents had been alive to hear those words, adding, "My father would have enjoyed them, and my mother would have believed them." Here's to Bobs everywhere. We meet in likely my favorite room here on campus, what a college library should be. If you were to film a movie about a publishing house and you wanted a room to capture the feel of that house, this is where you'd start. Tonight I've been asked to speak about myself, which is ordinarily not my inclination. I thought I would do so, though, in terms of you and the possibilities that lay ahead of you, like a day right behind the rain. I'll speak for a bit, then turn to the truly inspiring part of this evening, your questions and hopefully my adequate response. I grew up where I was later educated and still later returned to after a number of years spent in Washington, as Joe had just alluded to. Upstate New York, where I returned to, where I was born in a town of 2,188 people. Caledonia, a factory village settled by Scotch-Irish immigrants, travelers who paused and stayed here on their sojourn west. My town had the country's first fish hatchery. You could look it up. It had front porches where people witnessed neighbors' comings and goings. It had 5 grocery stores, 6 churches, and 1 bar. And I leave it to you to guess which building was almost always full. Father, where are you back there? Okay. I'm sure you'll appreciate the religious reference. My family lived on Church Street, not far from where an aging, rumored veteran of Teddy Roosevelt's charge up San Juan Hill sat on our American Legion building's front steps, dispensing free candy. Law and order in Caledonia crested up the hill, and our one policeman. After all, there was virtually no crime in Caledonia. Since Caledonia had little traffic and had no traffic lights, we did, however, have a Little League baseball team to play on, a million dreams to stir us, and as Dwight Eisenhower once said, the great and priceless privilege of growing up in an American small town. I was the oldest of 5 kids. My father, the high school guidance counselor, my mother, a housewife and later a high school librarian. We were, I suppose, lower middle to middle class. But back then, few thought of class. We were just Americans, simply and proudly. In high school, I ran track, played hoops and percussion, but not baseball. I had earlier, but by high school, I realized that it's often said that you can't steal first base. I could not even rent first base. I also participated in debate, but even before then, I loved to play outside, read, and yes, write, often, if not well, about politics and sports. I recall reading as a kid about Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was playing a town league baseball game when couriers arrived in 1860 to tell him that he had won the Republican presidential nomination. Lincoln said this, "I'm glad to hear they're coming, but they will have to wait a few minutes for me to have another turn at bat." Talk about a president to be with his priorities in order. Lincoln was the first president to play inside. He used its corridors and piece of paper. I learned to write quickly and deadline under pressure. As Ronald Reagan said of his career, most of my movies, they didn't want good, they wanted them Tuesday. So I learned to get my stories written by Tuesday. After 2 years at Gannett, I joined Hamilton College in the eastern part of the state as Director of Public Relations, a school many of you, I suspect, may have considered, because I didn't know if I wanted to pursue journalism or public relations. Another lesson, for those of you that are going into this field, it is easier to go from journalism to public relations than the other way around, because you bring the credentials of allegedly being able to write. At 27, I moved, as I always knew I would at some age, to politics. I decided I'd like to start at the presidential level. I didn't know any better. The problem was that I didn't know a person, father, not a blessed soul, in Washington, D.C., where presidential politics begin and often end. When I was 19, I'd seen John B. Connally come to Rochester to speak. You may know Connally. You've seen the film footage. He was in the front seat of President Kennedy's limousine when Kennedy was assassinated in the back seat on a trip to Dallas in 1963. Connally, silver-haired, full of charisma, he too almost killed by bullets from JFK's assassin. In 1971, the former three-term Texas governor, now President Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury, came here to Rochester to speak about the economy. Watching on television, I was blown away. I knew then that I wanted to write for Connally, recently declared at that point for the 1980 Republican presidential nomination. But how? It so happened that about this time, a former speechwriter for Nixon, Raymond K. Price, had just issued a memoir. A light went on. Maybe he had a thought. Problem, I didn't know Price. I didn't know one soul in Washington, as I mentioned. So I looked in the Washington phone directory. True story. Somehow found his name. That could never, ever happen again today. Price was a Connally admirer. I knew that. Knew that he too was amenable often to speaking with students. So I called him and asked if I could come to DC for lunch. Amazingly, he said yes. We met, had a great time, and unbeknownst to me, after our meeting, he wrote a letter about me to Connally. Lesson, where doors seem locked, they can often be opened. With Price, my sole Washington acquaintance, I began as the sole speechwriter for a man who would have torn up the pea patch in Washington, D.C. I'm talking to Connally. One lesson he taught me was mental agility. He said, I can play it straight or I can play it round. Talking about policy, just tell me how to play it. Quickly, I learned another lesson. It's for those of you that are going into politics someday, seeking office. In politics, jobs aren't necessarily long-term. Connally's wasn't as a candidate. He withdrew after losing several primaries to Ronald Reagan in the early going. Reagan also running for office. So after Connally bowed out, I became a senior editor of the Saturday Evening Post, as Joe had mentioned, America's oldest magazine, founded by Ben Franklin. I relished the cyclical nature of a magazine. If you're looking for a job to have, A magazine is a wonderful place to start. But savoring politics more, in early 1982, I returned to D.C. to join the now and new Reagan administration as a senior speechwriter, sadly not getting paid by the word. For the next 5 years through 1988, I wrote speeches for cabinet members serving the man whom, according to the Gallup poll, more Americans now call our greatest president than any other. Yes, Ronald Reagan. I wasn't asked in this poll, but if I had, I might have voted for George Washington, without whom we would not have a presidency, or Abraham Lincoln, who saved the Union, or Franklin Roosevelt, who beat the Depression and won World War II. Yet Reagan, president from 1981 through 89, eclipsed them all. Why? First, he was deemed a success. The United States prospering during his 2 terms. Reagan also helped end the Cold War. Moreover, he conducted himself as a president should, with humility and humor. Our then oldest president listed his age and used his age to poke fun at himself. A reporter asked about the accuracy of a Thomas Jefferson quote. Reagan said, "I know that's true because Jefferson told me." Above all, Reagan had an ability to project, coming from his radio, film, and TV career. He had actually begun his career as a broadcaster for the Chicago Cubs in the 1930s. This ability to project heightened his capacity to communicate. Rhetoric wasn't part of Reagan's presidency. It was his presidency. Speaking incisively, intuitively, with the gamesman gift for timing. He grasped America because he grasped Americans. Why we love this country. Our mission is, as Lincoln said, to be the last best hope of Earth. My favorite Reagan speech occurred on D-Day, June the 6th, 1984, the 40th anniversary of the Allies having invaded France in 1944 to ultimately save Europe. If you watch him, look at how he moved hardened veterans there to tears. They weren't alone. The entire country was moved to tears. Reagan's successor was his 2-term vice president, George H.W. Bush, as Joe noted. To Bush, unlike Reagan, public speaking was only part of the job. After all, this is a man who said, "English is my decency and honor," all of which Bush had. In 1990, Iraq's tyrant Saddam Hussein invaded neutral Kuwait. To Bush, the bully had kicked sand in freedom's face. So he organized the largest alliance of nations since World War II to kick Hussein out, and did, saying of the Gulf War, "Aggression will not stand." It didn't. Bush had almost lost his life in 1944. He was 19 years old. The Navy's youngest pilot shot down by the Japanese. And he modestly never talked of his heroism. Also so kind that whenever he spoke later of his 4-year-old daughter's death of leukemia 60 years earlier, he would invariably choke up, unable to proceed. In 1991, this was also the man who gave a speech to recall the 50th anniversary of the Japanese attack on our Navy installation at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Wookie told me of the speech I was privileged to write, "I have to be careful. I don't want to break down." Friends of his had died at Pearl. He didn't break down, but thrice he was moved to tears at the sight, which, as you know, propelled America into World War II. Bush was elected president in 1988 over Michael Dukakis, then lost to Bill Clinton in 1992. I tell friends they haven't lived until they've been fired by the country. In between, Bush won the Gulf War, dreamed of a new world order, and was president when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union died. In the time of Bush's death in 2018, Americans regarded him, said pollster John Zogby, a frequent guest at this college, as quote-unquote a great commander-in-chief, a war hero, father, grandfather, and father figure. Our last president from the greatest generation, the generation which, of course, beat depression and won the war. When people die, others generally say nice things about them. It's something we do, and that we should. When Bush died, all of the great things said about him by political friends and foes were true. I wrote for Bush for the 4 White House years, and then as his main writer for the next 10 years. 14 years in all, without one cross word between us. For that, trust me, Bush got the credit and deserves it, not me. Democrat or Republican, if you get a chance to work someday in the White House, do so, no matter what the job and how little the pay. Someone who's worked there will attest, anyone who's worked there, in fact, it is the greatest experience of your life. So when I left there in 1993, I faced the conundrum, the challenge, how to top the topper. Again, let your interest and skills intersect. Thankfully, yours is a time now, largely unlike, say, 60 years ago. Then you took a job, staying there often for the rest of your life. It was safe pay, good benefits, but often dull. It deadened the soul. Today, entering a field, you may change it maybe once, twice, some of you perhaps thrice, until you find what's right for you. In 1993, after the White House, writing and speaking were still right for me. By then, I'd written my first book at 26, and several years later, another book about my time in college, a long time gone. This book perhaps meant more to me than any of the others. It may also interest you. You can find it in any bookstore's 98-cent sale. Since although I wrote about a different time than yours, I suspect it addresses some of the same feelings as yours. Yours do today. About 1993, as well, a new version of a book on baseball broadcasting was released by Simon & Schuster, Voices of the Game, the history of baseball broadcasting on radio TV. Later, ESPN TV aired a 3-part primetime series based upon the book. I also helped research ESPN's Sports Century series. It's run with great frequency. You may have seen it. Again, do what you know, do what you love. Just because, and I don't say this to be unfair to lawyers, but just because there are 18 lawyers doesn't mean that you have to be the 19th. No one can live your life for you, and you can't live it for anyone else. So in 1998, as Joe mentioned, I was invited by the university to join its faculty. One course on public speaking, as Joe mentioned, the other on presidential rhetoric. The latter, on presidential rhetoric, is precisely a course that I wish had been available to me in college when I was your age. I hope to see you in one or more of those courses. Several of you I already have. The English departments, I am also director, I should mention, of the English department's internship program, having worked as a college intern myself in school. This program is open to English majors and other majors too. Hope to see you soon. I've always loved an academic climate. Loved it in Hamilton, loved it when I was an undergraduate, and do so here. I recall the feeling that if ever free speech, open, unfettered dialogue between and among us ever disappeared from college, you might as well bring in a bulldozer and tear down the whole place. This is true today. If it weren't, why would you be here? Not to repeat by rote, I hope, what some teachers and culture tells you. You could do that from home for free. You're here in part to be exposed, I suspect, to a variety of beliefs so that you can crystallize your own beliefs. Maybe change those beliefs later. Maybe keep them forever. Find what makes sense to you. To me, this is largely why a university worship. Save the best to last. Worship a higher being than ourselves. It is what this country, these freedoms, were founded upon, and without which America will collapse from within. We all have many identities. Differing folks. But none matter more than our identity as an individual and as a member of this country. A few parting words then for your possible consideration before I welcome your questions. All of them. Never forget that you can disagree with other people without being disagreeable. That you can debate back and forth while remaining friends. Seek a unity of purpose which benefits this country as a whole. Treasure not how success is the sum of what we have, but what we are. What we are matters far more. recall what Winston Churchill said of a great battle of World War II also applies to college. He said, "This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." In a real sense, college marks the end of your beginning. For those particularly who graduate this or next term, let me close with the penultimate words of a wonderful movie I recommended highly from my college era, Summer of '42. The movie ended, "Life is made of comings and goings. For everything we take with us, we leave a part of us behind." Thank you very much. Now for the fun part. Any questions that you might have about politics, probably more over sports. I've saved the best to last in that sense, but any questions that you might have or comments? Yes?
How is working in the White House and seeing the inner workings of the presidency affected your overall view of American life and American politics?
How does working in the White House and for President Bush,
Just in
or
general,
any president, affect my
along the presidency, affect your view of the outside American society?
right? Affect my view of outside American society? Yes. How does working in the White House and for president affect my view of American society? Correct?
Yeah, you get exposed to all the problems and stuff.
Yeah, I did get exposed to different strata of American society. Lower middle class where I came from, upper class tend to predominate in politics because, after all, money talks, at least in that sense. But no, I tell you, I went into politics for the same reason I hope that anyone who does, and that is you feel deeply about issues. For myself, those issues have always been middle American issues. Okay, you work hard, respect your elders. You don't ask anybody to necessarily help you if they wish to. You accept it, obviously. But the same traditional values I think that made this country great, and those are the values of my childhood. Coming to Washington was I think an eye opener in several ways. First of all, the money in Washington. Washington was filthy rich then. I don't even have an adjective for it now. Okay, and I do think that administrations of both parties tend to be controlled by the wealthiest donors, by the groups who scream loudest. Richard Nixon once talked about the great silent majority of his fellow Americans. That phrase has remained with us since he first uttered it in 1969. Donald Trump used it. Maybe someday a president will feel as Trump did about issues, but behave himself. If that's true, he'll probably be elected. But those are the issues that really moved me. I found that they didn't necessarily move colleagues, Republican colleagues in that sense, but I think Democratic colleagues as well. And so I think it made me a bit more cynical, but a bit more enlightened. And ever since then, I've waited for a political party to once again represent middle America, as it once did, even when Franklin Roosevelt was president. He came from the highest economic strata of America, but its values were middle class. And the reason I said that what matters is not what you have, but rather what you are. Economic wealth cannot propel an administration. It can't make that administration understand the average American. And I think that increasingly, neither political party is tuned to the middle class, to the great silent majority who don't protest, who don't have entree in Washington, can't pick up a phone and have a favor done for them by somebody they know at the White House or in Congress. And I think Washington, in my time, was very much estranged from the middle class, and even more so now. I remember talking to at dinner. I think it was probably my second year in the Bush White House, and there were a lot of Ivy Leaguers, a lot of privileged how will I put it, people who work in the Bush White House, which is fine as long as you remember why you're sent there. Too few people remember why they're sent there. And I was like, you still around? She meant it as an insult. I took it as a compliment. What it meant was that too many people in the Bush White House, the administration elected largely by the middle class, looked down upon the middle class or were ignorant of what the middle class wanted. I think that has increased ever since then, which is a reason to go in politics. We need good people, people from the middle part of America who go to Washington and don't get corrupted. I don't know if that answers your question or not. Yes?
How would you use your job as a speechwriter to implement these ideas and maybe put them in front of the president in that way?
I'm sorry, what was that?
How would you utilize your job as the speechwriter for the president to maybe express your own values and ideas? Would you use that to kind of convey your message to the president?
Yeah, how would I use my experience as a speechwriter to comment on other presidents?
Yes, or while you wrote the speech for president, would your own thoughts be in that speech as well?
Oh, would my thoughts be in speeches for President Bush, right?
Yes.
Absolutely. There are generally 5 speechwriters that write for any president. We had 5. I know that Reagan had 5. Obama has 5. I'm not sure how many Trump had. I don't think it mattered because, how would you write for Donald Trump? I say that with respect for the job he did, but he had such a unique vernacular way of expressing himself, shall we say, that I think speechwriters for him would be about as valuable as furniture that was for sale. I don't know, but I think frankly the same could be said of Joe Biden, and that is that I think it's very difficult to write for someone. And I'm expressing my views here, that was elected as a centrist, as a moderate, and yet had governed from the far left of the political agenda. I wouldn't want to do it. And you will have from time to time speechwriters who actually resign from an administration because they no longer can write for that administration. But we had 5 writers, and I think this is true of every president since then, who would divide their duties according to the skills that they brought to the table. We had a foreign policy specialist. We had a domestic policy specialist. We had a speechwriter for women's issues. We were one of the first administrations to actually have women as well as men write for the president. And I myself was assigned what I'll call value speeches, inspirational speeches. Hopefully there was some inspiration in the speech when I got done with it. But speeches that call from the president to be inspirational. And also I got a lot of wonderful events, sports teams every year. The 4 major sports have the champion come to the White House. And it's a kick, especially for me writing about baseball. Bush, of course, as many of you perhaps know, was probably the most baseball-savvy president in American history. He said that he first loved baseball when he picked up a bat at age 5 and said to himself, baseball has everything. He then went on to coach the game in college, to be the captain of his Yale baseball team. He was a marvelous fielder. His nickname was Mr. Smooth because of how dexterous he was around first base. A major league scout once told me that if they had had the position when he was there of designated fielder, not hit, he couldn't hit lead, but designated fielder, he could have made the major leagues. His son became the owner of the Texas Ranger baseball team, George W. Bush, who later became, of course, president. And Bush I remember once had writers and sportscasters from around the country simply brought into the White House at World Series time. He just wanted to talk some baseball. That's it. And so naturally, he and I got along very well along that axis, and a number of them as well. But I think that you bring something of yourself to your job. I think you should in any job, particularly when you have someone speaking to the nation and really speaking to the world. I mentioned the Pearl Harbor address when Bush gave it in 1991. He was the 50th anniversary of the Japanese attack, which of course propelled us, is the reason we got into the Second World War. And Bush was truly afraid that he was going to break down. He's a person of, as I said, modesty, reticent. You know, he doesn't show a great deal of emotion, but he feels it deep inside. This was so true of most of the people of the greatest generation. You know, they beat Hitler, they beat Mussolini, the Japanese war machine, then they come home and they don't want to talk about it. I mean, part of it was they wanted to leave the war behind, but the second aspect is that they were extraordinarily modest. It was a much more modest age than my age or your age, something I think we could use more of. But he was truly afraid, as I said, that he was going to just emerge in a cauldron of emotion. But he didn't, and at the end he could barely whisper. If you ever get a chance to look at Bush's Pearl Harbor speech of 1991, at the very last words that he said, he whispered, because he almost didn't get them out. He said, "God bless America, the most wondrous land on earth." And it was a very emotional speech. And as I said, he didn't want to give it. I had been left at the White House to write some other speeches, so I didn't go to Pearl. But a number of aides, policy aides, did go with Bush. I later found out they had to talk him into giving the speech. He was so afraid that it would emotionally move him that he would cry. And he didn't. I mean, it was emotional. I like to think it moved people. But it was done in a way that was disciplined and preserved his dignity. And that was true of him. So, for a speechwriter, Franklin Roosevelt, of whom I'm a great admirer, we might be speaking German today, were it not for FDR and Winston Churchill. Nothing against German, but I like mine voluntarily, not mandatory. And he had a great speech staff, Roosevelt did. Emmy Award-winning playwright, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, great economist from Columbia, and yet they all wrote as Roosevelt would speak. Any speechwriter should put a sign at the door, put ego in the ear, and leave it there. Because if you want ego, if you want to be recognized, write a book, write a play, do something under your own name. But when you're the speechwriter for the president, you're really writing for him. And you must be around him and listen to him as often as you can to familiarize yourself with how he speaks. Does he like long sentences or short sentences? Does he like to talk? Does he like to quote George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or both or neither? What kind of humor does he like? Bush was the product of Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, the great comedy that they gave America from the 1930s to the 1960s. So I remember giving him humor once, and it was topical humor, and he didn't understand it, so he wouldn't use it. He simply wouldn't use something that was in the least disingenuous, and it wasn't him. So I went back to the drawing board. I did Hope and Crosby. I was familiar with that, fine with me. And more to the point, it worked with him because he was familiar with it, and they were a part of his life as well. So that's I had the great fortune of working with someone, as I said, who was authentic, who was modest, who was patriotic. They don't come any better than that. Yes.
Follow up on that. Thank you for being here for something.
Sure. Bet.
I would imagine being a speechwriter at the presidential level and the intensity of the White House and politics and stuff. You're giving the commander in chief words to say, and as soon as they say them, they're picked apart left and right by everybody in the world.
Yes.
I would imagine you talked about that he never had a crossword to you, but you had a great relationship.
Right, right.
But I would imagine at some point perhaps you walked away saying, boy, I just did him some disservice, or what was the hardest part for you and how did you get over kind of what would have been the result of something that he
Uh-huh.
might have written or something like that?
Well, I mean, I feel only tongue in cheek that, you know, if he had better writers in 1992, he might have been reelected.
I don't know about that.
So at least some have suggested. But no, I don't necessarily think of a speech I walked away feeling that I did him a disservice, because if it was in the least disingenuous, if it was in the least superficial or dishonest, he wouldn't use it. So, you know, he spared me from making a fool of myself, probably, or at least, you know, gently doing him a disservice. But no, you know, it's interesting. Presidents who use politics sort of as their compass for a presidency. We were too much the other way. There was not one staff meeting in 4 years where we talked about polling or you know, politically what could benefit him and this kind of thing. He didn't want to be that way. He wasn't that way himself, and he didn't want to be cynical. Public service meant too much to him. After all, you know, he'd almost died for his country. How could you not feel an enormous fidelity to the country for that? So no, I don't think I did. I would have liked to have been, you know, I would have liked him to have been tougher toward the opposition, more partisan toward the opposition. He worked on the best of motives, and that's not true of most politicians, you know. So he was better than them in a sense, or more honest than them in a sense. So, I mean, there are things that I would have liked him to be that he wasn't. So I really can't say, geez, he should have said this because I want him to, or even that I think it's better politically for him to say this. He didn't want to do it.
So they reviewed all speeches?
Oh, yes. Oh, let me explain briefly how speeches work. When you're assigned a speech, given a speech, and you write the speech. You talk to people on the ground, you talk to policy people, maybe political people, and then you talk to people at the site itself, and then you do the speech, your first draft. And at that point, the speech goes through a process called staffing, okay? And this means that other speechwriters, the Department of Communications, the department that is germane to the speech, for example, if it's a speech on foreign policy, the speech would be run by and often run over by the State Department and the Department of Defense. And so this is a good policy because it kept us from making mistakes, making factual mistakes. And this is how you would do it. Some people were very constructive in terms of the changes they suggested. Some simply wanted to be a big shot, wanted to prove how smart they were. You know, whether it was something that Bush liked or not, was no matter with them. You know, they were determined that what they wanted was going to go in the speech. And those were the people that, to put it lightly, would much rather do without. But after the staffing process was done and the corrections were made, it would come back to me. And I would incorporate, when I could, the suggestions made by the different advisors. The problem was that some advice contradicted the other, so you basically had to negotiate between that. But then, and only then, did it go to the president. Now, many times he would have talked to you at the beginning of the speech, but there were some that he didn't. So literally, the first time that he saw the speech was the speech that you gave him. You were, after a while, pretty much able to surmise what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it. That's what I mean by following the president, so that you're familiar with how he speaks, what he wants to say, what he doesn't want to say, And after a while, we read it pretty well. Not always, but most of the time. But there were 1 or 2 times in 4 years when you missed. You didn't guess correctly. So they went to Bush. Bush wrote it back to you in his writing saying, don't understand this, don't understand that, want you to redo this over. And his voice, his vote is the only voice at that point that counted. Not about ready to say, geez, Mr. President, I really don't want to do this. If you did, you would be a former White House speechwriter. Yes?
Since you've been at the U of R for 20 years, what's been your favorite part being at the U of R?
I'm sorry, interviewed what?
You said you've been at the U of R for over 20
Yes.
years, so
Yes.
what's your favorite part of you being here?
My favorite part of being here? Well, I grew up in this area, so the U of R to me was like the Harvard of upstate New York. And it's a great privilege to be here, especially in a room like this. As I said, every room on campus ought to be, this old timey in terms of looking like it belonged in a film studio. But I think the knowledge that U of R students bring to issues, speaking to presidential rhetoric that we have, because that goes back to the beginning of radio TV in the 1920s, and we have a number of presidential chapters that we read and speeches that we go back on. And students generally, not always, but generally bring a sense of history and a sense of what a president meant to the country. So I think that is, we take this for granted as the second thing, but this is a beautiful campus, especially in the fall, especially when the leaves come out before the dreaded snow begins. And, the architecture here is stunning. It's also coherent and cohesive. There are a lot of schools that, they're trying to expand buildings and all the rest. And it looks like they work with, 13 different architects on 13 different buildings. And it sticks out like a sore thumb. Here, you go from building to building. It's all part of a whole. The quadrangle out here and there, wherever it is, near Brownwells and near some of the other buildings. The main one, the one where the tent is still up, I think, as I look after Meliora. You take that beauty for granted, but if you went to other schools, as I do, to speak, you wouldn't. This is really a class of its own. So I think that the pedigree of this place, this will open doors for you if you handle it right. And I suggest that one way to handle it right is take advantage of the Career Center of the alumni. It's almost without exception alumni who went here, now alumni, let's say at a publishing house or at a newspaper, or if you're a lawyer at a great law firm in New York. Talk to the Career Center about who the alumni are that might help you, and either they or you make that overture, because alumni want to help. They want to feel relevant. And you go to an alumnus who went here 20 years ago, and he wants to feel that the U of R needs him, and he's very, very willing to help. So that's what I would suggest. So those 2 or 3 things. The faculty, I think, is top notch. It really is. I think there's an objectivity here that's lacking in some schools. This should be a place where people are not afraid to speak their values and their grievances if they have them, but also their love of country and what they believe to be germane to the best interest of the United States. We still have that. We need to keep it. Yes.
More on the speech writing. What's the process that goes into the State of the Union speeches?
Oh, what goes into the State of the Union?
Because you've got so many different facets of what the
Yeah.
president's talking about, like speech writing.
State of the Union. I worked on 2 of them. And it's an assignment I wouldn't give to my worst enemy on earth. Let me tell you this, the prestige is fine, but speechwriters are supposed to be silent accomplices. They're not supposed to make a big deal about themselves, which is how it should be. As I said, you want to be a big deal, go off and write under your own name. State of the Union is delivered by the president in the last week of January, traditionally. And so in December, it's assigned to a writer. And it's amazing, once the word gets out as to who the State of the Union will be written by, how many new friends that the writer has never met in his lifetime, will never meet again, but how many new friends the writer has. And some writers get seduced. They actually think that, boy, oh boy, somebody in this department or that department or a bureaucrat working here or there thinks that you're a magnificent writer, can't wait to praise you. And of course, what they want is their own pet project mentioned in the State of the Union, or a program to be mentioned in the State of the Union. Something that may be, and usually is, of no help whatever to the goal or the message that the president is trying to say. But they simply want their name in lights. They want to be able to brag that Joe Schmo and Jane Schmo, whoever else is around, that, wow, look at me, I got, my pet project in the State of the Union. But, so that's something that you really have to navigate. And it's wholly held in a sort of way, because it should be a wonderful privilege, but it gets sort of obscured by the egos that you have to transcend.